So, as I said about in the prayer, talking to the Lord, I've been involved in ministry to the LDS community since really I first heard the gospel. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, and so we weren't raised I wasn't raised in a theological context and course. I didn't understand really who Jesus was. My only understanding of Jesus really came from watching, I think at Easter time, really watched a movie at Easter. It was on television about the life of Christ and everything else, and that was the context of that. I understood there was a guy named Jesus who claimed to have died and rose again. At about 17 years old, I heard the gospel for the first time, interestingly, from Billy Graham on television. That's where I first heard the gospel. Thought what I had was a conversion to Christ, and so that's my story is not necessarily overly important here about God's work in my own life throughout the years. But when I first heard the gospel and I turned to Christ and I experienced sort of really this life change, and I was bringing a Bible now to school because I couldn't get enough of it. I was reading it in classes, getting in trouble for reading it in classes, reading it at lunchtime, and it wasn't long after I had experienced this transformation and really this love for God that I ran into a person in theater arts class when I was reading the Bible in high school. And while I'm reading the Bible, he sat down next to me and he said, hey, what are you reading? I said, it's the Bible. And he's like, are you a Christian? I said, yeah, I'm Christian. Are you Christian? He said, yeah, I'm Christian too. And so we're chatting and we're rapping a little bit. And then he says to me something kind of peculiar. And I'd only been a Christian for a very, very, very short time. We're talking like a month, maybe 3 months I was a believer. And he says something odd to me that struck me as odd, even as a new believer with really no theological training. He says to me, so what level of heaven do you think you're going to? And I thought, that's hopefully the highest level, I suppose that'd be the good thing to do, right? That's what I'll aim for right there. And so through talking, I asked him, where are you from? And he said, well, my denomination is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I had remembered that a couple months prior to that, there was a guy that came to my door and gave me a card to visit the Washington, D.C. temple. And I lived around D.C., and so I remember this vividly. So I go to this Christian bookstore down the road from my house. I'd become like a fixture there. I was there all the time reading books on the floor, and I knew the owner named Tony. And I walked in one day after school this day, and I said to him, hey, Tony, could you give me any information on the denomination of the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And he says, Jeff, that's not a denomination, that's a cult. And so he runs to the back. He says, hang on a second. And he comes back and he basically drops a load of books into my lap. And he says, here, just take it. You don't need to pay me for it. Just read it. There you go. And so I went home, and that night I watched some film, some documentary on Mormonism, and I also read some books. And I ended up not sleeping that entire night. I didn't even sleep. I went to school the next morning without sleeping the night before, just reading and digesting all this. And I was in awe of the fact that we were using the same language, but we were not talking about the same things. And I knew very little at the time, but I was just couldn't believe. And I was really stunned by the fact that this guy I was talking to that I thought, was claiming to be a Christian was in fact not a Christian. And so I had gone to this photocopy place before school, and I remember vividly photocopying pages and pages and pages of Scripture, highlighting stuff, pages and pages and pages of Mormon stuff, and I even got a photocopy of Joseph Smith's arrest record in 1826 in Bainbridge, New York for crystal ball gazing and the fine that he paid. And I remember that I came with this docket of my case against Mormonism, and I came to my friend and said, hey, you're in a cult, take this! And, I thought that was, done, he'll be saved, right? And so what ended up being the course of my relationship with him is that for a period of about 6 months, we developed a really good friendship, and we talked all the time. And I ended up actually meeting with Mormon missionaries, numerous sets of Mormon missionaries from his ward. I went with his family during Christmas time to go to the Washington, D.C. temple. And I remember on the car ride home, I'm sitting in the van with a guy who was a black Mormon, and I remember that I'm in this hour-long car ride home talking to him about the racism in early Mormonism and how could you be black and be a Mormon, and I don't really know quite what I'm doing, but I'm doing everything I can to reach this guy. So as time went by, I remember vividly we were in my bedroom one day with my friend, and we're talking, and he started crying as I'm ministering to him. Again, I know very little at the time, but I just have this passion to reach him. And after the course of our relationship, and all this conversation leads up to this moment where I'm giving him the gospel, and he says to me finally as he breaks down, he says, Jeff, I know everything you're saying is true. He says, but I can't leave Mormonism. He says, if I leave the church, I lose everything.